Eat your heart out, Pilot Wings. It's Skydiver's time to shine in this Atari archive. In the previous video about Human Cannonball, I mentioned how odd it was that it came out alongside another Daredevil-themed game. This short-lived experiment in theme synergy might be something that only could have still worked in this last gasp of the 1970s Daredevil craze in the United States, but I can safely say that Skydiver, released by Sears' Darediver, is a much stronger and funnier game than its canon-based counterpart. I would go so far as to say that it stands in the upper echelon of great multiplayer games on the VCS, and certainly it's one of the stronger entries on any home console in its day. Skydiver is by Jim Huether, who was last seen in this series for his October 1978 release Flag Capture. Whereas Flag Capture was a bit rougher and more divisive in its reception, Skydiver is a fast-paced, easily understood game that was, according to an interview with Huether, the best-selling VCS game before 1980's Space Invaders. Much like Human Cannonball, Skydiver is based in part on Owen Rubin's arcade Skydiver game, though Huether notes that he was already halfway through development of it before he realized that there was an arcade version that he could see and play. Both the arcade and VCS games have similar concepts. Two players leap out of planes, open their chutes, and try to land on the target while contending with the wind. In both games, you can also control your descent once your chute is open, though if the wind is too strong, there's little you can do to push back. After 9 jump opportunities, the game ends. There are a few differences between the two, however. In Rubin's arcade game, the lights behind the Skydiver marquee will flash one at a time, and will stop when a player leaps out of the plane. Successfully landing will earn that letter below their score, and spelling out the game's name will, depending on the machine's settings, give you bonus points, an extra life, or a free game. Rubin was insistent on this pinball-style feature, and Skydiver Arcade is an extremely early example of that crossover between video games and pinball, revisited in Exidy arcade games like Mr. Do and Ladybug with specific methods to earn a free game, pinball style. Beyond that, both the arcade game and the VCS version determines how many points a player earns on a successful landing by how long they're in freefall before opening their chute. This is actually quite similar to an early text-based computer game called Splat, popularized through David All's 101 Basic Computer Games book. The idea there was to open your chute as late as possible without smashing into the ground to maximize points. Skydiver takes that concept, adds graphics, and an actual target to hit. A key difference between the arcade and home versions of Skydiver involved the actual chute deployment. In the arcade game, much like Splat, there is a bit of a delay before your parachute fully deploys. If you open it too late, you won't have time to get your chute open before hitting the ground and splatting. The home version just has the chute open pretty much as soon as you pull on the joystick. The arcade game also has a computer opponent that you can compete against if you don't have a second player on hand. And as a neat little secret, Rubin snuck his initials into the game's Object Graphics ROM, though there is no known way to actually see them in the game itself. Huether said that the VCS was obviously a less powerful platform than custom arcade hardware, so he couldn't mimic all the aspects of Rubin's game accurately. Thanks to the Atari house style of having multiple variations on a cart, however, he was able to provide a greater mix of Skydiver rules that ultimately resulted in a more robust package than a straight port of the arcade game could have provided. The first 2 game types are similar to the arcade game, with respective landing pads for each player to try and touch down on. Game 2 has smaller pads than Game 1, but otherwise they're the same, and both players can use the windsock indicator to see exactly how strong the wind is blowing and how that might impact their leap and their chute deployment. Games 3 and 4 remove the wind factor, but replace it with moving landing pads. Like before, Game 4 makes the pads smaller than Game 3, but they are otherwise identical. These game types are tricky to find the right timing for your jumps, though without the wind, you can eventually get a sense of when you should leap from your plane and when you can deploy your chute to catch the pad with some regularity. The final game type brings back the wind and sees you playing chicken. There's one landing pad in the middle of the screen that both players are trying to land on, but only the first player to successfully touch down gets points. The difficulty switches adjust how quickly your plane flies by in game types 1 through 4, but they do nothing in the chicken variant to avoid giving one player an advantage. This is probably the most entertaining option, since it allows you to directly screw over your opponent. The result of all this is a game with enough variety to make it a blast to continually try and land your Daredevils on their targets. And hey, if you miss, you get a disproportionately funny little animation and sound effect of your jumper plopping into the dirt with just their head and arms above ground. It really shouldn't be as funny as it is, and yet every time I see it, it gets a chuckle out of me and anyone else I've played the game with. In all, not bad for 6 months of work for Huether. For a game that reportedly sold well, however, Skydiver seems to have largely gone overlooked in the press. Outside of mentions in advertisements, a 1980 rebate offer, and the occasional column as a game that's now available, Skydiver flew under the radar. The only other mention I found was a blurb in Vidiot's tongue-in-cheek summary of VCS games several years after its release. Looking to Atari Corporation's sales records from the late 1980s, they reported selling around 11,000 copies of the game between 1986 and 1988, a relatively small number. This suggests that Skydiver was more a flavor of the month. A simple game that just fell to the wayside as VCS games grew in complexity, though never quite so far to the wayside that it fell off the market entirely until nearly a decade after its release. But that's fine. Whether or not it was a sales juggernaut in the 1980s, Skydiver is still a really exciting game in short bursts with a second player. Definitely worth a look, even if only to mash your avatar into the earth a few times for laughs. Next time, Blackjack's back, and it's brought a few friends.